Now, the two young men who I asked, they said, well, that sounds like a massacre to me. I suspect, without having to ask you, most of you found pretty horrifying the idea of dropping a weapon which reaches 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit in a civilian area with the only possible purpose of incinerating the flesh of the people who are occupying those places. Most of you find that pretty horrifying. But maybe the most horrifying fact of all is, for all of you who are currently getting paychecks, some part of the deduction in taxes from your paycheck made that possible, what happened in Gaza. Now, that's not rhetoric. That's not just empty talk. And it's not talk designed to whip up your emotions. It's what the leading human rights organization in the world concluded. The Nobel laureate in peace, Amnesty International. What happened in the Gaza Strip was to a large extent made possible by US supplied weapons, munitions, and military equipment paid for by US taxpayer money. So, it's all the more reason why we should be conscious and concerned about what happens in that tiny little area called Gaza. Now, one main question remains, which I want to look at in the 25 minutes that's left for me. One main question I want to look at is the obvious question. Why? Why did Israel do it? Why did it commit a massacre in Gaza? We'll leave aside the possibility that they're just evil and they want to kill Palestinians. No, that's not a very satisfying answer. It's not a very convincing answer. So, what is the reason? Why did they commit that massacre? Most of you have heard the reason, but why should I tell you? I'll let you tell me. What's the general explanation you hear in the media for why Israel committed a massacre? Raise your hand. You must have heard something. Good. What's your name?
Cameron.
Cameron.
The explanation that I regularly hear is that Palestinian militants fired rockets over into Israel.
Okay, very good. The answer you hear most often in the media is that the Palestinians were firing rockets into Israel, and as we often heard, as President Obama, His Royal Highness put it, he said, if my two daughters were being the object of rocket attacks, I would do anything I could to protect them also. Because we all know Barack Obama is a good husband, or his wife will knock him out. And that sounds pretty convincing. How many people heard that explanation and you thought to yourself, oh, I think the Israelis had a point? So raise your hand, let me hear. How many heard that explanation and thought there was some justice to it? Come on, raise your hand. I don't believe it. Nobody heard that explanation? How many heard the rocket attacks explanation? Raise your hand. Good. And I don't believe you thought that it was not fair. No, you did think it was fair. You're just afraid of me. And that's why you're not raising your hand. So, let's look at the facts, and we'll see whether I can convince Cameron that he's mistaken and that explanation is not believable. And I'll do my very best to be absolutely scrupulous, that means honest and accurate, about the facts. Number one, in June 2008, which is not so long ago, in June 2008, Israel and Hamas, the resistance movement in Gaza, Israel and Hamas entered into a ceasefire. Did you hear about that? Okay, Cameron knows about the ceasefire. Now, what if I were to tell you that if you go to the official Israeli website, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they have a publication posted on the website which says, and now I'm quoting, Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. And here was the problem. Israel says they don't like Hamas. And Hamas won an election in January 2006. When Hamas won the election, Israel, along with the United States, they imposed an economic blockade on Gaza. They didn't let food in. They didn't let medicine in. There was no electricity. Israel and the United States imposed a brutal blockade of Gaza because they didn't like the government that the Palestinians elected. They thought the Palestinians made a mistake. They elected the wrong government. So, in order to convince the Palestinians, they really have to rethink their decision when they elected Hamas. We're going to impose this economic blockade, deny them food, deny them medicine, and then maybe that'll convince them to change their minds. So, in June 2008, there's a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. Hamas says, we'll stop firing any rockets at Israel. But they say to Israel, you have to do something in return. And what do you think Hamas asked Israel to do? What do you think Hamas asked Israel to do? Okay, you. What do you think?
Stop attack.
What?
Stop attack Hamas people.
Well, okay, go ahead.
To release the blockade?
Yes, of course. Hamas said, we'll stop firing rockets at Israel if Israel lifts its brutal blockade of Gaza. Now, lo and behold, what happens? Hamas continues to carefully maintain the ceasefire. But Israel refuses to lift the blockade. Hamas still maintains the ceasefire. Then, on November 4th, our election day, when all of our attention is fixed on the election, on that day, Israel decides to go into the Gaza, and it kills 6 Palestinian members of Hamas. And it knows that when it kills 6 Palestinian members of Hamas, Hamas will retaliate with rocket fire. It knows they'll do that, and that's exactly what they do. They retaliate with rocket fire. And now Hamas says, we will renew the ceasefire. We'll renew the ceasefire, but Israel has to lift this blockade. This blockade is destroying us. This blockade, says Human Rights Watch, the leading human rights organization in the world. Human Rights Watch says the blockade is illegal. You're not allowed to do that to another country because you don't like the government they elected. You're going to deny the people food, medicine. Ask yourselves. There are people here from many foreign countries. There are a lot of foreign countries in the world which didn't like the government the U.S. elected in 2000 and 2004. In fact, it's probably the case that every country in the world didn't like that government. But does that mean they have the right to impose a blockade on the United States and deny the American people food, medicine, electricity, until we decide not to vote for President Bush? And so Hamas said, you have to lift the blockade. Israel said, no. You have to stop firing the rockets unilaterally and unconditionally. With no conditions, you can't tell us we have to lift the blockade. We're not going to do it. You're going to just have to stop resisting. Okay? Now I have to ask you, Cameron. For the Palestinians at that point, the choice was to resist or to die. Did they have the right to resist? Israel says you have to stop firing the rockets unilaterally, meaning just your side, and unconditionally. That means you can't set any conditions. Do they have the right? Well, what do you think?
To continue to resist, do they have a right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And that was the opinion of the Palestinians. Now, what did the whole picture look like before the massacre of December 27th? I want to just give you some sense of the picture, and then you decide for yourself whether Israel or the Palestinians had the right to use force. There's a very good Israeli human rights organization called B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. And every year they issue an annual report which describes the human rights situation in the West Bank and Gaza. So they issue a report for 2008 from January 1st till December 26th, before the massacre begins. And this is what they find. Let me quote. It says, for that period, January 1st to December 26th, Israel killed 455 Palestinians. At least 175 were civilians. The Palestinians killed 31 Israelis, of whom 21 were civilians. So just before the massacre begins, 15 times as many Palestinians as Israelis were killed. 15 times as many. If you limit yourself just to civilians, 9 times as many civilians were killed, Palestinian, as Israeli. Then you turn to the Gaza. Let's just look at Gaza. According to B'Tselem, 160 Palestinian civilians were killed. Cameron knows about the rocket attacks. Okay. In 2008, 7 Israelis were killed due to the rocket attacks. That means for every Israeli civilian that was killed, 20 Palestinian civilians in Gaza was killed. Now Israel complains, some of you will know, Israel complains Hamas is holding one Israeli soldier captive His name is Corporal Shallot. How many of you have heard about that? Well, this is a very informed audience. You all know about Corporal Shallot. But now I'm going to ask you another question, and let's see if you're honest in your answer. Everyone knows the tragic, terrible story of Corporal Shallot, the one Israeli soldier who's being held by Hamas. But how many of you know that as we speak now, Israel is not holding one Hamas terrorist captive? They're holding 11,000 Palestinians in jail. How many of you know that? I don't know where you get all this knowledge from. I don't know what website it is. That's pretty damn impressive. Israel's not holding one, it's holding 11,000. Of those 11,000, 600 are what are called administrative detainees. That means no charges, no trial. They're just thrown into jail. No charges, no trial. 50 of them have been held for more than 2 years. No charges, no